Hi, this is Dr. Randy Bach. Today's September 15, 2021. The days go by, the months go by, the years go by. We still have coronavirus with us. I am going to do a coronavirus conversation tonight. And of course, it's really a monologue, maybe a diatribe, or possibly a rant. And my name is Ranty. At least that's what some of my friends call me, or Randy or Randall Bach. And I'm a general practice physician by trade. The last few years, I've been doing some other things, entrepreneurial, and some writing as well. And I have a couple tomes in the works. I'm working on a book, as I've probably mentioned, called Dodging Cancer. That's the title for now. A patient-facing book about how people can deal with cancer. And it's a pretty broad topic. It's kind of Cancer 101. And I like it, actually. I've learned so much by learning what maybe to present. So one of the things that is near and dear to me is the last great pandemic, Zika. People may not remember it because it's all of like 5 years ago, maybe going on 6 years now. It was in the news, 2016. 2016 was a pretty, I guess, interesting year, and it brought a lot of momentous news and changes. Brexit came into being. That was the British deciding to leave the European Union, and it's gone through a few shifts and changes since then. But nobody had ever heard the word before. 2016, pretty much outside of England, and Zika, same type of thing. Almost nobody had ever heard of this word, and it kind of came out of the blue. It was a big deal. It's been dwarfed essentially by the current great pandemic. I say great in the sense of size, not great because it's been great. It hasn't. COVID-19, coronavirus, Wuhan disease. But for its time, it was big news. It was one of the top 5 news stories in 2016, according to the people who judge these things after the Trump-Clinton election. Russiagate, Brexit, one other thing I can't remember, and Zika. There comes Zika. Why am I talking about Zika when it's a coronavirus conversation? Well, again, I'm working on the topic, and I'm not gonna do the whole thing because I think I have a book on the topic almost ready to go. But I'm gonna give you a presentation that I gave the other day. I'm gonna give you kind of a shortened version of it because the audience I was speaking to was a little higher potentially on average in credentials than the audience I'm looking for here. A lot of MDs and epidemiologists and so forth. So I'm going to give you the kind of the basics of what I presented there, but still with I think there are going to be some points from which we can think and talk about coronavirus. Not so much because Zika was a virus or is a virus and coronavirus is a virus, but more about what happened with that pandemic, how well were facts determined, what's happened since then to those facts, have they been redetermined, have there been retractions, recanting, anything of the sort, because frankly, the reason you don't know about it now is because it didn't become the great everlasting illness that people predict for COVID. So again, there are different circumstances. Zika is a mosquito-borne virus. It's called arbovirus because it's the mosquitoes are part of the, I can't think of the term right now, arthropod-borne viruses. So basically insect transmitted. And arthro just means joint, so they're kind of the little insects with a lot of joints. Anyway, I would like to, maybe show you some of the slides I have, and we'll talk about conclusions or concepts or analogies or whatever later. So without further ado, I'm going to pop this slide up. Whoops, I have had this problem previously. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. There we go. All right. So this is a few different slides here. I'm going to I think what the problem is let me just. I think the problem is that I have Dragon up. So let me just see if I can get back to the slides here. All right, apologies. So what we have here is up in the upper left, we have Zika as a search term on Google Trends. So it was never really spoken about before 2016. It was a harmless virus from Africa. It's cousins with dengue, which is endemic to Brazil and other parts of the world, tropics, mosquito-borne as well. And that's been always the bad actor. Zika is named after the Zika forest in Uganda from 1947 when it was found. And between 1947 and 2016 or 2015, it had never caused possibly a single human illness at all, ever. The most anyone claims is about a handful, like fewer than 10. So it basically became a comet in 2016. It was brightly into view and then promptly disappeared. So here's Brexit and Zika, as I mentioned. Google Trends also watched this in the United States, and the number of kind of reported cases went from 0 in 2015 to 50,000 in the United States total. Most of them are in the tropical territories, Puerto Rico and elsewhere, Virgin Islands and so forth. And the United States still had as many as 5,000 claims of cases. Whether they were all there or not is hard to say. They kind of mimicked the people Googling it at the time. So it mimics this burst in interest. So people are interested, everyone kind of claimed they had it, and then it disappeared. I'm going to go backwards one slide. Sherlock Holmes, I was kind of my entree to reading fiction and novels as a kid. I couldn't believe how wonderful Sherlock Holmes was, the stories and so forth. I was really captivated. Now, one of the famous instances, though, of Sherlock Holmes' deduction is the dog that didn't bark in the night. So usually he finds some piece of evidence, the typical kind of smoking gun kind of thing, and footprints and so forth, and finding traces of clothing and so forth. But in this case, what he noticed was the presence of an absence. The dog in the house in question didn't bark. And so the Scotland Yard policeman says, is there anything, other point to which you would wish to draw my attention? To the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime. The dog did nothing in the nighttime. That was the curious incident. So in this case, the curious incident is Zika never doing anything before and never doing anything since. There has not really been any mention of the separate problem Zika causes, according to Brazil 2015, Brazil 2016, that it causes microcephaly, which is definitionally the small heads of babies born that, it can either just be a measurement thing, but usually it's associated with potentially severe mental retardation and, a life that is not going to, be similar to those who are able to go through and pass school and whatnot. So this is what was going on in Brazil at the time. So this is kind of a busy slide, and I'm not going to spend much time on it. But basically, two things happened in Brazil that year. Early on, there were a couple physicians over in mid-2015 who decided that dengue fever, which had been in Brazil for decades and possibly centuries, was not causing the same things that dengue fever had always caused. That it had to be something else, this new thing, and we'll try to get to that in a little bit. Zika, and then part two is that a physician in Recife, which is spelled Recife but pronounced differently, northeast Brazil, tropical part of Brazil, was finding what she thought were more cases of microcephaly. And then the two of these got connected. So if you want to read this along, you can pause and read the slide later. Just as a comparison, a virus that is long known to do that, something like that, cause a congenital infection is rubella. We have MMR, and the people who are cautious about COVID vaccination are not anti-vax. I have given out thousands of MMR, rubella measles, mumps, rubella vaccines. And the reason it's given is not so much to prevent the childhood illness, which is kind of like a measly rash. The problem is that rubella defects can occur in more than 80% of the first trimester cases. So if you get rubella as a young pregnant woman, first trimester, you're potentially going to get a defect in the baby more than 80% of the time. So it occurred in all infants, infants infected before the 11th week, and deafness, heart disease, and those are big issues. So this is viral penetration. Zika, at its worst, was about maybe 4% of the people theoretically with Zika were getting microcephaly, and that's depending on how you classify microcephaly, is at the time in Brazil was about 2.5% of all kids, because they were just calling them small heads. It didn't necessarily mean any illness. So from 2.5% without Zika to 4% with Zika. Some people thought it was a little bit more, but then the numbers calmed down when they really checked the cases. So this is a tough slide to look at, because microcephaly is kind of a scary, terrifying thing. These are children, that likely will not lead normal lives. And this is the hero of the story from Wall Street Journal article. This is Vanessa van der Linden Mota and her mother. They're both neuropediatricians in Recife, Brazil. And so this doctor kind of made the clarion call. The alarm sounded when she thought she was seeing more of these babies being born. The problem and issue is that there was no real way for her to do this from her own little office here, because Brazil had kept no records nationwide or in Recife of numbers of babies on average born with these problems. And of course, they were using different diagnostic criteria. They didn't know whether you're just talking about babies with small heads or the really severe cases. And there's no distinct cause for the general small head syndrome. So what was the context of this? Well, this is a little bit of a history of Zika, found in East Africa, Uganda in 1947. It wasn't, you've never heard about this probably before 2016. Nobody did. I went to medical school. We never touched on Zika ever once. And we had courses in tropical diseases and parasites and so forth. Really, there was nothing going on until this thing here in the island of Yap, which is, north of New Guinea and east of Philippines. And they diagnosed it as dengue. And I'll show you kind of why in a little bit. These are pictures from the internet of dengue and Zika. And I'm not going to tell you which one is which right off the bat, but they are identical. It's a little bit like looking at coronavirus, COVID-19 and SARS-1 and coronavirus to do the cold. They look alike. These things have the soccer ball appearance, and they look exactly, one is dengue and one is Zika. And the reason they look almost alike is because they're both in this family called flaviviruses, which mean yellow, and it's named after yellow fever. And hepatitis C is probably the most famous member, but it's a little bit more unrelated. And that can also turn you yellow a little bit. So in honor, here there's yellow and yellow. But Zika and dengue are very, very similar in appearance and very, very similar in their genetic makeup. And insofar as Zika may or may not cause illness, we don't know. It would do something probably similar to Zika, but it may be that what they're calling Zika was really dengue, because dengue has been around really for quite some time. So the interest in Zika before 2015, 2016, this is worldwide Google Trends again. So this is how much people searched for the term, was essentially zero. But if you expand it, you can see a little creeping up. Right after 2007, and the areas it was being searched for was French Polynesia, this kind of like New Caledonia. Both of these are in the same Pacific Micronesia area. So that's where people were looking for this term. Before 2014, the term had never really been, there's really nothing written about it. This is one article in 1964, an article 2009. 1952. That's pretty much it. So nobody's talking about it. Nobody's writing about it. And, to have a Zika virus infection in man was publishable in 1964 because that would be the first proved case of human infection with Zika. So there's nothing going on with Zika in the decades before 1964 and after. There's also might just as well have been this little relation virus, so they couldn't even tell it was that. So it's unlikely that all of a sudden Zika got weaponized and did stuff because millions of people in populated areas throughout Africa, Indonesia, and so forth had been exposed to it apparently, or dengue, and nobody had ever complained of illness, and nobody ever complained of increase in microcephaly. So all of a sudden, it's a thing. I'm just going to go look at dengue. Dengue again probably came. The mosquito is called Aedes aegypti, which has the word Egypt in it essentially. So it's an African mosquito. Dengue is African illness. We can maybe go back to this. The dengue probably comes from West Africa. There's a mosquito belt here because this is tropical, similar to Brazil, and so the mosquitoes, travel over time. And dengue and Zika, again, they have very similar, genomics, and they're in the same family. Blah blah blah. So Brazil has had it either since the beginning of the 16th century, when the slave trade started from Africa to Brazil. And just as a side note, this was the majority of the slave trade. I mean, the United States talks a lot about slavery, but most of the slaves went to Brazil, and they were treated much more harshly. Not that slavery is good anywhere, but there were different gradients, and so there's some issues still in Brazil on that basis. But it also came dengue, and who knows, maybe Zika. But they've had infections kind of endemically for the last few decades, and over here, cases reported, millions of cases. So it doesn't look like dengue brings any great immunity because they have it over and over again, slight variants, dengue 1, dengue 2, dengue 3, a little bit like influenza, but it doesn't look like one really does that much for the other in terms of immunity because they're on subsequent years, so forth. And you can see the map showing a little bit of spread throughout Brazil. So this is the dengue area. This coincides with the kind of wet tropical area of Brazil, which is frankly most of Brazil. And also I'll show you later, it coincides with the graph of the mosquito belt itself, which Zika does not. And we'll get to that. This is a really busy slide. I don't expect you to spend time on it, except to point out this is how one would differentiate Zika versus dengue. So you have to look here, dengue and Zika, and it's a very complicated, this never ever happened in the year that they thought all of a sudden there was Zika. So in 2015, nobody did a single Zika test proving Zika. It kind of came out of thin air. It's different from what we're dealing with now. When did it come out of thin air? It came out of thin air in these two places in eastern Brazil. We can pretty much spot the names of the doctors. I'm not going to spend time on it now, but they started searching because they thought, it was chikungunya. I'm not going to make you spell or say that name. It's a tough one, but it's listed up here. And the symptoms are potentially similar. And they decided, well, maybe not that, it's Zika. I think Zika was an interesting term for them to have because they got to discover something brand new. Zika had never caused any problems in man. All of a sudden, they're claiming it causes problem in man. This is a way, if you are, kind of just a pebble on the beach, you get to be the biggest boulder, a lot of bright lights and so forth when you claim something brand new in the medical world and probably elsewhere and so forth. It's kind of like cold fusion. They got to invent something, and no longer are they hiding in the weeds. They are famous. So this is, again, busy slide. You can stop and read it later. This is from the Wall Street Journal article from the doctor in Brazil I showed you earlier, who thought that something weird was bringing on microcephaly, and she thought also there was more of it. In her case, her eureka moments, speaking of, I think, Archimedes, the Greek, when he runs out of the bathtub, he's so excited he forgets to put on clothing. Because he has a burst of an idea in his head. So her eureka moment was having two non-identical twins, one with microcephaly and the other without. Now, mind you, twinning itself can bring microcephaly because one baby might not be getting the adequate blood supply because the other is kind of stealing it. So that is one of the possibilities. but for some reason, she thought this had to be a brand new virus, even though there are other viruses that can cause microcephaly. Well, when I say cause, they're not. No, we don't really know any that cause it. There's some associations, and so that's all we have are really a loose association, kind of like you might look like your third cousin or something like that. There's some loose association, but it's hard to really work out the entire thread. So this is a separate side of the problem. What is actually called microcephaly. Brazil changed its standard. Its standard is still not what the WHO has for intergrowth standards, which are more refined, and they are. This is kind of mathematics standard deviations (SD). Below 2 standard deviations means on the low side of the curve, only 2.5% of babies, regardless whether they are proportionally, whether they're normal shape, they happen to be small individuals or premature, whatever. If the head's small, they call it microcephaly. So using this very lax standard up until 2015, this is a time that the doctors in Recife were deciding there was an epidemic of microcephaly. This criterion would have brought more cases based just on the criteria. When the criteria changed, the numbers that would be estimated and suspected would go down. And using different criteria, the Pan-American criteria would go down even lower, this intergrowth standard, so forth. And so using different standards, you're going to get different things. Depends how you measure it. It's a little bit like with COVID, what you decide to call a case. Now we call a case when somebody has a positive swab, regardless of symptoms. We call a case before that, like in March 2020, we called it when you had illness and so forth. So this is how you determine cases of microcephaly. This is vastly different. So that has one very big analogy. This is a tough one to go over. I don't, this is really not the take home and learn, but this just shows you how you would have to diagnose microcephaly. This didn't happen in Brazil in 2015. There was a panic and people were overcalling it. They were overdiagnosing it, and they wound up cutting down the number of cases that they called it to actual cases, probably more than tenfold, probably 20 or 30-fold at the end of the day. And whether those were more than baseline is a whole nother question we'll get to as well. So this is how you would diagnose this. This didn't happen in Brazil, I can almost guarantee, on any regular basis. Maybe a few cases went to specialists and so forth, but this is not how they were doing it. They were doing it by the tape measure, and they were looking at a chart, and they were probably doing, kind of erring on the side of caution and calling everything microcephaly. These are the causes such as we know, but none of them are really precise. Deprivation, what does that mean? Poorly controlled maternal diabetes, maternal hypothyroidism. These are things that are sort of associated, but they are pretty much, they all, the ones that are underlined track with poverty, say, less coordinated lives, lack of money, lack of education, lack of disruptive injuries we're talking about here. These are situations that are bad. If you're getting beaten and that kind of stuff. So, your babies might come out too soon. They might not be well nourished, and situations happen. So there are things that are associated with microcephaly, but it can also be, having a twin. It can also be a stroke. Lack of blood supply. It can be things you eat or drink or exposed to, radiation, alcohol, medication, so forth and so on. So there are a lot of different choices, including these, virus. Bacterial, and so forth. So there are a lot of different things, but none of these actually always do it. Rubella, as we saw, pretty much causes deafness and some mental retardation, not so much microcephaly. These other ones are not really known for causing microcephaly per se. They can cause some other brain issues if they're happening during pregnancy, and potentially HIV. But none of these do it 100% of the time, the way rubella causes rubella syndrome, which is mental retardation and deafness. These first three have a kind of a tendency to have a higher rate of causing the things they cause, but not microcephaly. And so these are just all associations. None of these have kind of a satisfy what's called Koch's hypothesis, not Coca-Cola. It's a guy, K-O-C-H, we might call it Koch or something like that, but it's called Koch's hypothesis, German, which is kind of if then this. And if that happened, is because of this. So when you get a one-to-one identity that this thing always causes that thing, and this thing can't happen without that thing, then you have something that, mostly, likely a scientific law and whatnot, a little bit like gravity. It always goes down, it never goes up, and so forth. Anyway, but microcephaly as a syndrome doesn't follow this at all. Mind you, there is a genetic one that does. If you have a certain autosomal recessive gene, which is very rare, it's like 1 in 10,000 births, you can get a microcephaly every single time if you get those two specific genes. So 1/4 of the babies from the parents who have this recessive gene each will produce microcephaly over and over again. That is the only reproducible cause of microcephaly, nothing else. So just kind of to sum up a little bit of the tornado or comet, whatever you want to call it, of events, the doctors who were finding what they thought was Zika or chikungunya originally, or some kind of weird, mild case of dengue. And I don't know why a mild case of dengue couldn't just be mild dengue. They wanted to rename it, and they renamed it as Zika. They found a very, quick, almost identical cousin to dengue, but it had to be something different, sexier name, so forth. So they married basically a Zika virus with 0 prior confirmed human Brazilian cases or any cases anywhere on Earth. And Zika had never been in Brazil, to these microcephaly cases assigned without firm criteria, never shown to be at increased levels over baseline. So there was, in Brazil at the time, they had a lot of cases based on loose standards, and they had no documentation that there were any more than there ever had been before. There's one connection between these two groups. Dr. Carlos Brito, who's in Recife, and he's a physician, he was with the first group that found Zika, and then they called upon him, the doctors and neuropediatrician Vanderlinden Mota called on Dr. Brito, and then he asked the babies' moms, the microcephalic babies' moms, after the fact, and potentially some months after they had given birth, and he asked them whether they had had a rash or fever during pregnancy. Well, this is kind of like a very vague thing. Do the moms remember? Who doesn't have some kind of rash or fever during pregnancy? And so he got a lot of yeses, and then he assumed that meant they had Zika, like out of everything. Like it couldn't be dengue, it couldn't be, I don't know, the cold or coronavirus or whatever. It had to be Zika. And so this falls into certain kind of scientific no-nos. If this were the NFL, they would have thrown the flag, like 5 of the referees would have thrown different flags for this. It's selection bias, it's lack of blinding, observer bias, and recall bias. And you can stop and read this slide on your own. So what happened as a result? Well, once Vanderlinden Mota and Dr. Carlos Brito announced this to the press, they had a hard time sitting on the story because they didn't want to be kind of accused of letting this Zika microcephaly epidemic go without warning people. The fact is that the warnings wouldn't have done any good, even if this were real, because it was maybe 23 weeks prior that they would have had the exposure and the pregnancy percolate. Now maybe you want to warn people about Zika, but you should be warning them about dengue anyway. And in pregnancy, you should just be careful about getting mosquito bites. And presumably most people in Brazil know about mosquito netting and insect repellent and so forth, and staying away from swampy areas and whatnot. Most people in Recife live in, pretty sophisticated housing. Not everybody, there are shanty towns and whatnot, favelas they're called, but there are also a lot of, high rises and whatnot. So it's a pretty modern city. Anyway, across Brazil, and again, this is a very busy slide, there were very low levels like this of microcephaly. And then when the announcement came at the end of 2015, this is week 49, boom, all across Brazil, the numbers went up enormously, including in places where they weren't complaining of Zika. So there's a fair amount of kind of word of mouth, hysteria and piling on and overdiagnosis. How do I know that? Well, I don't know it for sure, but it appears to be the case because these are the cases by geography. And they pretty much did, unlike the dengue map we saw, I don't know if you want to remember this, or we'll go back very briefly. There it is. Unlike the dengue map, which kind of, it grew and grew and grew and covered a lot of areas, pretty much in the tropics where the mosquitoes are. And I'll show you that map later. This is not the case here. This, whoops. So here, so here's the mosquito map. This is the Aedes aegypti distribution. And this is, pretty much kind of the wetter tropical areas as you might expect. And so there's a whole swath of them. So if dengue were there, mind you, it would also have shown up Colombia, Venezuela, and so forth, and did not do the same thing, did not show the same microcephaly. People did not have Zika pandemic issues in Colombia. We can get to that at some other point. But what you see here is huge numbers of claimed cases in and around Recife, where the alarm was sounded and where the doctors were talking about it. They had a WhatsApp group called CHIKV, CHIKV, which started as chikungunya. They never changed it to Zika V. And there were a lot of doctors on this chit-chat kind of network and passing the word that this was an issue. So it was not just the newspapers, it was the government. They had a health warning and whatnot, and that nobody felt like they could sit on this. And so the cases just ballooned right around here. You can see the smaller, lighter green ones are based on confirmed cases. So these are notified cases. The numbers were enormous. But even if you look at the confirmed cases, they don't necessarily follow the tropics or the mosquito is. They follow geography, closeness to this area. So there's a little bit of word of mouth issue. And this is also picked up in Google Trends, where you see the Northeast states are the ones really talking about Zika. And these are search terms, microcephaly, where you say it in Portuguese. So this is a very similar slide showing the population areas. And these are all big cities, including Recife. But the numbers don't really correlate with population. They don't really correlate with mosquitoes. Certainly Recife is tropical, no doubt, and there are mosquitoes and there are cases of dengue, but it doesn't track with the Amazonian jungle. It doesn't track with geographic borders, Colombia, Venezuela, and the Guianas, Suriname and whatnot up there, French Guiana, British Guyana, so forth. So there you have it. I think what happened here is kind of a word of mouth, basically a panic, hysteria, a broadcasting, and then a worry, and then an overdiagnosis, and there you have it. This is a map from the city itself. The black of Recife, the central district is wealthier. This is white. There's one by the beach that is white. The red dots are cases of microcephaly. They pretty much congregate. These are the favela kind of areas, a little bit poorer in black. They have a higher density there. You could argue maybe that's because of population density, but these are pretty high-rise areas. And so I don't think it's specifically that. You could argue, well, maybe the wealthier people don't hang out with mosquitoes as much. I mean, you have a strong argument for that potentially, but it also could be that it's all those other things that track with poverty, and this wasn't necessarily any different in 2015 from prior years. What else? Well, this is about height, and they were using standard charts which were developed in Brazil's southeast, where Rio de Janeiro. I'll show you the population centers again. Brazil, the government, the history, the population, the laws are pretty much down here. This is like their, Tokyo, or Shanghai, Beijing combo. There's Brasilia, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo. Those are enormous megalopoli, and there's a lot of stuff going on in there, including the health charts, such as they're made, and the growth charts, which are dealing with taller European individuals and babies from those longer people, and they will have, in general, bigger head circumferences. The Northeast and North have shorter people. This is, again, a little bit older in time. This is from until the 80s, but a lot of this carries on based on population differential. So, there were some suspicions at the time, and I give this credit to Julia Beluz, who was writing for Vox, and she pointed out that there was some bias. But you didn't see this in any of the press. If you remember it, at the time, there were news stories. There were a lot of the videos of the babies with small heads and how horrible this was, and people had travel advisories, just like they did today. They had warnings not to travel to the Rio Olympics. There were a lot of cautions about mosquitoes and nettings and whatnot. So there was a lot of disruption, especially to Brazil, because this coincided with huge investment on their part for the Rio de Janeiro or Rio de Janeiro Olympics. and those were kind of landed like a dud because people stayed away in droves, particularly younger women, pregnancy age. So there was a lot of, she's pointing out a lot of things we're talking about here, so it's not a mystery per se, but this was never really broadcast in the same way as the panic. The confusion over suspected and confirmed cases, difficult diagnosis, an incorrect baseline. Like I said, they had the wrong standard that was too lax, changed to one stricter, and awareness bias. So that once you tell people, they get freaked out, and so they start looking for the problem that they think they should look for. Once they actually tried to make a federal registry, they never made an official one, but some researchers in the following years tried to do this, and they went back and looked at microcephaly. This is supposedly the pandemic year over here, 2015. Guess what? Once they started looking back and checking the numbers based on different criteria, these are 3 different criteria of diagnosing microcephaly, they found that these numbers, again, don't really look any bigger or different from these. The whole thing there's not like it was 0 over here. They just started. So really the graph should start here, but be that as, or actually here, because there's no 0. So it should start in the 4th quarter. They went back to like early 2012. And so if you look at all these numbers here, they don't really look any different. They did find a tiny increase in severe microcephaly. This is really, we're talking about as a percent, 0.1% of babies. It's very, very difficult when the numbers are that small to notice anything. And it was never noticed after that. It was not noticed again in the following year. And how do we know that? Well, this is from the New England Journal of Medicine. And this is a very difficult chart to understand. The kind of blue-gray color here is Zika infection. So they're saying, mind you, they never found a single case from the laboratory diagnosed of Zika in 2015. The doctors, Dr. Brito and Kleber-Luce, when they said it was Zika, they had zero substantiation. How this got to be the news and carried, by everybody, I don't know. But this is what they called it. And so they're saying there was Zika, and then they had more microcephaly. Again, this is not necessarily more microcephaly. What happened is they went down the next year. They said, oh, we're going to have more Zika, and they were, I don't know how they were checking this, whether they were doing some testing finally. Then they say 23 weeks later, so this first trimester problem in the embryonic phase, they were predicting a huge number of microcephaly cases again. Not necessarily more, although it could have been more because they said there's more Zika, but at least that much because people would have done some contrary, kind of counterbalancing by more mosquito netting, staying away from more using spray and whatnot when you were pregnant in particular. But actually what they found was almost zero microcephaly. So the numbers went down enormously, probably because there was better scrutiny, because they were using some of the mosquito stuff, and probably because this A never caused B in the first place. Getting back to Koch's hypothesis, A causes B, A doesn't cause B. So if you do this once, every time I drop a ball, it falls down. If I start, dropping the ball, it doesn't do anything. It stays in midair. And then you might argue, maybe I'm in a spaceship or some zero gravity place. But if you want to, determine that Zika causes something, in the very, very next year, it didn't do anything. Did we hear a retraction? No, we did not hear a retraction. This is a similar type of retrospective, very busy slide. I apologize. But the point here is they looked back for 2016, and they looked at mothers who had microcephaly and mothers who didn't have babies with microcephaly. And they didn't find, now they're able to test it the following year, so they tested for dengue and Zika, and they found almost the same amount of infection in one group versus the other. So there was 70% here, 57% here, not much different. If you look at the whole bunch, the clotted number of dengue and Zika, it was 81% here, 83% there. This is not that much different. There's not enough here to explain any of the microcephaly. So what do we have here? This is how, in mathematics, logic, you determine if a hypothesis is true. You come up with an idea, and if you basically reproduce it and it follows the reality, then your theory is correct. If you think it doesn't happen and then it doesn't happen in reality over and over again, then it's also potentially correct. But there are other types of errors. A type 2 error is when you have the theory and it's false, but you don't admit it's false. So this is what happened. These are kind of major central figures who were determining the thing in the first place. Christopher Dye works at the WHO, the World Health Organization, and in 2017, so this is basically a full year after the scare, he agrees and admits that there was no microcephaly in the following year. So what's his reason? He said, well, we could have overestimated the number of Zika cases in Brazil. So chikungunya can easily be mistaken for Zika. Well, so can dengue. He's I don't know why there's no dengue, because that's really the one. But chikungunya doesn't cause microcephaly. And frankly, neither does dengue. This is what NPR wrote. I didn't write this. So Dr. Albert Koh, who is currently the chair of epidemiology at Yale School of Public Health, he kind of, nixed Christopher Dye a little bit, and you can read this yourself. So he says, oh, maybe it's dengue. So another hypothesis is that prior exposure to dengue may actually enhance or promote the risk of birth defects from Zika. This did not turn out to be true, as we can see here. As we can see here, when they looked at all these dengue combinations, there was no difference in dengue concentration in the normals, the moms of normal babies versus the moms of microcephalic babies. So he would have a hard time. I assume he got funded and he went on to study it, but we haven't heard his answer. So I assume that also means that it didn't happen. It wasn't true. Other people, went on to other potential explanations of why it never happened again in 2016 in Brazil, and frankly, why it never happened again, causing microcephaly. That is, in other places where they found Zika. They found it in Rajasthan, India in 2018 without microcephaly. And everywhere else they found it, it didn't do anything. We were told that there were going to be 1 million microcephalic births in excess per year after this Zika discovery. Now, this hasn't happened. They were basing this on, there are 3.3 billion people who live in the tropics. And when you add up all the pregnancies and whatnot, you would get 1 million based on the fraction of pregnancies with Zika that they thought would turn into microcephaly, 4% or more. So that never happened. Thank God, thank God it didn't happen. Again, has anyone mentioned that this is not the truth? No. There are still advisories about Zika. If you go to the OBGYN, you'll find posters about Zika, what you should do to avoid Zika so your baby doesn't get microcephaly. So these are, other kind of like throwing up your hand a little bit, but without ever, attacking the underlying thesis. So this one, he mentions that, well, the finding of no alternative causes for geographic differences in microcephaly rate leads us to hypothesize that the Northeast region was disproportionately affected by this Zika outbreak. So what Dr. Oliver Brady is saying, that if you go back a number of slides here, he's saying the fact that there were more cases of Zika, of microcephaly, it must have meant that there was more Zika here. Again, nothing to do with the fact that this is kind of like what was broadcast and what people were worried about and what people talked about, and the huge number of overdiagnosis. Another theory came about. This might sound familiar. Was a variant. It was a single mutation, kind of like we hear about Delta variant and whatnot. A single mutation helps modern Zika cause birth defects. The minuscule change allows the virus to more readily damage brain cells. There's no evidence of this. And this is, I think, been refuted for the most part. You don't hear much about it. You don't hear about Zika at all, again, because it's not doing the thing they said it did originally. So despite billions of research dollars spent and thousands of literally thousands of investigative papers created within the instantly busy Zika research field, all of the original concepts of the Zika microcephaly connection seem fairly intact and unchallenged within the scientific community. And speaking of which, I kind of passed over this aspect on the previous slide. We have our friend here, Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's pandemic Zika, a formidable challenge to medicine and public health. So he's writing this December 2017. This is, essentially 2 years after the Zika microcephaly pandemic, as it were, or epidemic, or whatever you want to call it, or fallacy. And he's still on this. I'm going to show you on the last slide some of the things he said about it. You know, there's the kind of a Linsky-ite expression called, you know, you should, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. You should always use a crisis to mold opinion and gain power. Probably Machiavelli said something very similar, but it's the truth to Saul Alinsky, and Rahm Emanuel used it when he was mayor of Chicago and when he was Obama's chief of staff, I believe. Anyway, this is something that happens here. It's not, at this point, it was not a formidable challenge to medicine and public health. It actually had disappeared. So 2 years after the fact, he's still pumping this. Like, why, you know, what's up with that? You know, I think there's you know, not letting a crisis go to waste is something that happened in Brazil with Zika. You know, Zika was, I'm just going to maybe turn off my screen for a second. You know, Zika was not really allowed to filter down or turn off because a lot of people found it a useful item, you know, for their own agenda or agendae, multiple agendas. For instance, in Brazil, still, abortion is basically illegal. It's a predominantly Catholic country. And a lot of people don't like the fact that abortion is illegal, both inside Brazil and outside Brazil, you know, the left in Brazil, the non-religious people and so forth. Anyway, once Zika came about, this was, they wanted emergency abortions. Kind of opened the door for this thing because, you know, if you've been near a mosquito, would you want to have a baby with microcephaly? Mind you, the numbers were hugely exaggerated on your rate and issue. And if any, it's turning out to be, you know, minuscule, like those numbers we showed before. Severe microcephaly, 0.1%, 1 in 1,000, 1 in, you know, 1 in 2,000, whatever. So, but they wanted, you know, anybody who'd been exposed to mosquitoes and, you know, maybe test for Zika or maybe not, to be able to have abortion. That, of course, would have, you know, led to further laxity in that. And if you want to get rid of abortion, you know, that's, excuse me, get rid of abortion constraints and change the laws, I think you should go about changing the laws, but not use a virus and not use a potential pandemic for those secondary issues. And of course, this is redolent of what we're seeing with COVID as well. So let's get back to what we're getting back to. So this is where we were. So what are we left with? That certain completely untested cases, essentially synonymous with dengue, because they had always been dengue. And again, you could have severe dengue or mild dengue. With COVID, you could have severe COVID, mild COVID, or non-existent COVID, frankly. So these cases showing up in dengue endemic areas were instead definitively, excuse me, so the hypothesis was that these were instead and definitely a never before seen in Brazil Zika, which had never caused any problems in humans. And then claiming more microcephaly without data comparisons with very lax standards in one area of Brazil during a panic implied a nationwide increase, which it didn't, and it never was, and that one of these improbabilities had caused the other. That's the Zika microcephaly pandemic. And it has never been refuted. It's never been taken down. Nobody has apologized. Nothing. Billions of dollars were lost. You know, lives were changed. The military was called out in Brazil. They had, you know, lockdowns and so forth, as you know, probably not to the extent they have them now. But a lot of the stuff was a dry run on some levels. I don't think they were predicting it, but a lot of stuff they did, these kind of heavy-handed measures without very much in the way of data backing it up, were done right off the bat and right to begin with, and then carried with the press with never any retractions and so forth. So I'm going to leave you with Dr. Fauci. Maybe I'll read it in Fauciese. Finally, it's important that we not assume that pandemic Zika is a one-time crisis that can be met, controlled, and then forgotten or relegated to historical review. God forbid. I mean, if you're running the NIAID, you know, and this is your business in a sense. I mean, they're, you know, his salary probably doesn't change the way businessmen do, but he might have outside interests. He might be connected with people. You know, people in public office do make money on the side. I mean, look how wealthy, you know, the Clintons have gotten, the Bidens have gotten, so forth. People may not, you know, they make probably a standard salary in office, but on the side and out of office, you can make money from public office. So here's the crisis. So let's get back to this. Over the past 4 decades, we have seen the dawn of a new infectious disease era in which mostly quiescent arboviruses have begun to aggressively emerge and reemerge around the globe. including dengue virus. Okay, I'm going to stop that voice. West Nile virus and chikungunya virus. All the tropical world and much of the temperate world is now at risk and is likely to remain at risk for the foreseeable future. How we deal with the Zika pandemic is likely to become a roadmap for future challenges. Well, I agree with this part, okay? Nothing else. I think everything else is exaggerated. Zika didn't carry on. People say the same thing about COVID. It's going to be here forever. We're in the age of COVID, and people are going to be wearing masks forever. We're going to have one, variant after another. Well, this thing died off. Zika died off. It is gone, effectively. We don't really test for it. We don't really see it. We don't see microcephaly associated. It's not like rubella syndrome. It does not have this 100%. You have rubella first trimester, you got some problems, whether it's cardiac, deafness, or retardation. But you have rubella syndrome almost all the time if you have first trimester rubella. That is not the case with Zika. It is probably close to the case with toxoplasmosis and cytomegalovirus, which are maybe about 1/3 of cases. But with Zika at its worst was a couple of percent, and probably that is zero. So how we deal with the Zika pandemic is, I actually will Fauciize this. How we deal with the Zika pandemic is likely to become a roadmap for future challenges. Well, that's hard to disagree with. It did become a roadmap, and you're on that road right now. It's not a road of your own choosing. Others have chosen this road for you. If you want to get off the road or you want to draw new lines on the map, please go ahead and do that. That's going to be it for me tonight. And I look forward to hearing your comments and feedback. Thank you very much. Again, I actually do have a page on Zika. It's called Zika Remembered on Facebook. Please go over and like it if you like. And I'll probably cross-post this there as well. But tell your friends, and any comments, criticisms, questions, if you want to help fund some of these, I'm probably going to be starting a one of those Patreon kind of things, taking contributions, donations to keep things going. I don't have to do that. Obviously, I've been doing this on my own, but it is a nice encouragement, and I would certainly appreciate being able to do this more already than I have, because there are obviously constraints such as one has, trying to make do in the world. Anyway, thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening.